In this lesson, we're going to be looking at how to solve trig equations. And these are going to be easy and they're going to progressively get more difficult. What's going to be some of the most difficult part is making sure that your answers fit within the given interval. And as I go through this video, on each part I have included a picture from a graphing calculator. So each time when we look at the picture, it's going to be constrained by the interval that it's given. So here would be 0 to 2 pi. And also what this is saying, I've graphed on one part of the calculator sine x, which of course is the curve, and then I've also graphed the line y equals 1/2, which is this right here, and then where of course they intersect, those are our two answers. Yes, you could trace it on the calculator and get an answer, but it's not going to be accepted, because what we want to do is we want to give exact answers when possible. Now, you should actually just know the answer to that question from your trig and your chart that you've memorized. But let's just go through the algebra. How are we going to get x by itself? Well, you take the inverse sine of both sides, and so we're asking what angle gives you a sine ratio of positive 1/2 in the interval of 0 to 2 pi. Now we should have two answers, and they should be exact answers. What are they? And it should also be in radians. So you should know it's pi over 6 and 5 pi over 6. If you punched it into your calculator in radian mode, you're going to get some yucky decimal. Don't want that. But if you wanted to put your calculator in degree mode and you punch that in, your calculator is going to say 30 degrees, which you could change to pi over 6. But your calculator is only going to give you this one. You have to know that sine is also positive in quadrant 2. So it's a matter of your memorizing of your unit circle and knowing the algebra. Here's another pretty easy one. So this graph is from 0 to just pi, because that's the interval. This wave right here, that's 2 cosine x, and then this is the line y equals the square root of -3, and you can see that between 0 and pi they intersect one time, which means there's one answer. Let's go through the algebra because you have to show me your steps. So I'm going to get cosine x by itself, so I'm going to divide by 2. And at this point I should just know the answer, but I'm going to keep going. How do we get x by itself? We take the inverse cosine of both sides. So again, I'm asking what angle or angles between 0 and pi does cosine equal to -3/2? Well, cosine is negative in what two quadrants? Okay, thinking about the unit circle, cosine is negative in quadrants 2 and 3, but this only goes up to quadrant 1 and 2. So we can only have an answer between pi over 2 and pi. What is that answer? It's 5 pi over 6. Again, something you should have memorized. But again, if you had used your calculator in degree mode and you had actually punched this into your calculator, inverse cosine of negative square root of 3 over 2, it would have told you 150 degrees, which is in quadrant 2, but your answer must be in radians, because that's what the directions said. So those first two are pretty easy. Secant. Right, so again, this is a graph from between 0 and 2 pi of the secant of x, and y equals to -4, which is this horizontal line. And you can see that the graphs intersect at 2 points. They don't intersect up there, so we should get two answers. Well, how am I going to get x by itself? I could take the inverse secant of both sides. That's not going to help me. I would have x equals the inverse secant of -4. That is not in my unit circle. I would have to get out a calculator. Oops, I don't have an inverse secant button. So let's change it. What do we need to change it to? Let's change it to cosine. Well, secant is 1 over the cosine of x. Now we need to take the reciprocal of both sides. That's legitimate, or you could think about cross-multiplying however you want to do it, but if I take the reciprocal of this side and take the reciprocal of this side, that is a legitimate math action. Now I can take the inverse cosine. Right, so let's think about it. I've got between 0 and 2 pi, cosine is negative. We know we have two answers. Again, if you go back, you're thinking the circle as opposed to a graph like this. The cosine is negative in quadrants 2 and 3. So I need answers between pi over 2 and pi and 3 pi over 2. So you get out your calculator. You can leave it in degree mode, but this is not going to be a pretty answer. So I would go ahead and put my calculator in radian mode, punch in the inverse cosine of negative 1/4, and what does your calculator give you? It gives you about 1.82. You're going, well, where is that? Well, think about that. Pi is 3.14, about. Pi over 2 is 1.57, and so 1.82 is between those two numbers. Right, so this is pi over 2, this is pi. Right, so we're saying, what is that value? About 1.82. But I need to know what this answer is down here in quadrant 3. How are you going to do that? Well, there's a couple of different ways. I think about reference angles. So here, my calculator has given me 1.82. I need something in quadrant 3. So that would be negative 1.82. Is that a good answer? Well, no. Even though that's in quadrant 3, it's not between 0 and 2 pi. I need an answer between 0 and 6.28 approximately. That's 2 pi. I need it to be positive. So how can I get that answer? Well, I can add 2 pi to that. If I do that and add 2 pi, it's going to go all the way around. That's going to give me that answer. And I'm going to get about 4.46. So using the calculator is actually harder than memorizing that unit circle. You've got to think about what your calculator gives you and how do you get those other answers. I know that was a little confusing. Let's go through another one. Again, we have cosecant, so I've graphed the cosecant. I've graphed y equals to negative 3, and this is between 0 and 2 pi. So I know I should have two answers. This is pi, that's 2 pi, so I should have one in quadrant 3 and one in 4. So I don't have a cosecant button on my calculator. Let's change it to sine. Then take the reciprocal of both sides. Then take the inverse sine. Then calculator, radian mode, inverse sine of negative 1/3. What does your calculator give you? It gives you negative 0.34. Let's go back to that interval. My answers have to be between 0 and 6.28. Those are all positive answers. That's not acceptable. So again, if you're looking at the unit circle, I need answers. Where is the sign negative? In quadrant 3 and quadrant 4. And look at what the calculator told me. It told me negative 0.34. Well, in problem number 3, the example right before this, how did we make a negative angle into a positive angle? We added 2 pi to it. Right, so negative 0.34 plus 2 pi is about 5.94, which is definitely less than 6.28. That's in quadrant 4. Right. Now I need that answer in quadrant 3. So I need from here all the way there. How am I going to get that? Well, this part is pi, right? And pi is about 3.14. Well, how much is this part? Well, it's the same distance as that, so it's positive 0.34. So here I can take pi and add it to 0.34. Again, that's called a reference angle, and I need it all the way around plus that reference angle. And you should get about 3.48. And remember, pi is 3.14, again approximately, and so that is an answer in quadrant 3. And depending on if you're using your pi button or if you're punching in 3.14, your decimals may be just a little bit different, and that's okay. Now we're going to get into a little bit more complicated algebra, and we're going to be changing up the interval. Now we have an interval between 0 and 4 pi. We also have 3 terms. The good news is that it's all sine of x. The bad news is that it's a quadratic. So what I punched into my calculator, I actually told the calculator to graph that between 0 and 4 pi. And then we want to know, when does it equal to 0? When does it cross the x-axis? How many times is that? I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 times. It might be more. Maybe that w goes up a little bit more, but I think I'm looking for 6 answers. Let's see. How am I going to get there? It's quadratic. So if I kind of looked that and changed it to, instead of sine, because that's just scary, and changed it to something like this. Remember substitution? Just this, I tell people to think about that. That's really what you're factoring. So how would you factor that? And yes, you need to know how to factor. Let's see, 1 and 1, and they both be negative. That would factor to that. But really need to be in terms of sine. So let's rewrite that. And so instead of w, I'd have sine x. So now that I have factored, go back to your basic algebra. You set each factor equal to 0, and we solve for x. Well, at this point I'm going to solve for the sine of x. So I'm going to add 1 and divide by 2, and here I'm going to add 1. I've got to go back to here. So remember, the whole circle is 2 pi, so I've got to go around the circle twice. Now, this one was problem number 1. Remember? We talked about that. When does the sine have a ratio of positive 1/2? Well, you can go back and look at number 1. When was it? At pi over 6 and 5 pi over 6. But that was the first time, right? So those are those 2 angles. But then I had to go around the circle again. So how do I get those other answers? I have to add 2 pi, because again, because of this interval, I've just got to go around the circle twice. So if I add those, I would get 13 pi over 6 and 17 pi over 6. Now let's look at that. When does the sine equal to 1? Again, you can think about the unit circle. You can also think about the graphs that we just did. Now this is from 0 to 2 pi. The sine only reaches its peak of 1 at one spot, at pi over 2. So x is also equal to pi over 2, but again, if we got to go around the circle again, I have to add 2 pi to that, and I'm going to get 5 pi over 2. In total, let's count our answers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And looking back at that graph, this equation crossed the x-axis, or y is equal to 0, 6 times. So it does correspond. I would like for you to try this problem on your own and be prepared to discuss it in class. But again, I am going to give you some hints that I have graphed this over here between 0 and 2 pi. And since that's equal to 0, we're looking when does it cross the x-axis, or when does y equal to 0 at 2 points. You should get two answers, and I'm even going to make it even a little bit easier for you. They should be exact answers, so not decimals, and they should be positive. Again, work this out on your own. You can pause the video, go back and look at number 5, think about factoring, and exact answers.